Good morning, everybody. I'm so excited to see you here today. Thank you so much for joining me. I am going to do a little bit of window reshuffling here really fast so I can look at my notes for today. Today, we are going to talk about the A in heart, which is all your relationships. Very excited to talk about this. There's a lot to cover. And I totally think I could have made a couple of days out of this one. So let me finish the shuffle here really fast. Let's see if this works. Okay, so as you guys know, or hope you know, this might be your first day joining me, but this is Back to Business Week. And it's not necessarily all about back to business. It's built around this idea that our kids are back to school and it's time for us to get back in the swing of things. And to do this, I'm walking you guys through the Heart Goals acronym. And the whole philosophy behind the Heart Goals acronym is to help you prioritize your task list so that you can live a balanced life while you achieve your dreams. And you're going to hear me say that more and more often because that is the core of what Heart Goals is all about. I'm so excited to have you with me today. And what we're going to cover today are some relationship questions, like how do I identify toxic relationships? How do I eliminate toxic relationships from my life once I've identified them? How do I set boundaries so that I can have healthy personal relationships? How do I find sharp people? There's a proverb that says, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. So how do I find more sharp people that can sharpen me and surround myself with those people? How many meaningful relationships do I have time for? How do I build meaningful relationships? So this is a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about. We're going to start off by talking about toxicity. I'm going to give you a lot of information about that because I am a big believer of boundaries. So we're going to talk about toxicity. We're going to talk about, and then we're going to move to talking about boundaries. And then at the very end, I've got a couple of tidbits for you on building meaningful relationships in your life. So first of all, we throw the word toxic around a lot these days, I feel like. So I want to talk about really briefly why toxic relationships are bad. Outside of the fact that they make us feel terrible, right? Have you ever been in a toxic relationship or had a friendship that was really toxic, or maybe a romantic relationship? Toxic relationships can cost us a lot of pain, and that pain can be a bit of an iceberg where just a little bit on the surface looks like it's showing or hurting, but underneath, all that stuff does some serious damage, and it can take a lifetime to heal and repair from that stuff. So I don't know about you, but I'd rather just not go there. The second thing about toxic relationships that makes them bad is they can imprint themselves on our hearts, our souls, and our minds. And unintentionally, that imprint will perpetuate onto others. So we will unintentionally cause the same hurt that's been caused to us onto other people. And I also don't want that at all. Toxic relationships can contaminate our self-esteem and our happiness and the way we see the world. They can cause us to have a negative mindset, a negative mentality, a scarcity mentality, and that's not going to help us move forward. Toxic relationships will decrease our confidence and cause us to second guess ourselves on important decisions, which is going to cost us time and productivity and is not going to help us. And ultimately, they just make us very ineffective. We can't move forward if someone's always holding us back. So I'm figuring that you probably, if you don't, like, stop and think about a relationship that you had that felt really toxic. Like you just started to feel like this person was always dragging you down and making you feel terrible. So I've got a list of things that to talk through with you guys, ways you can identify toxic relationships. But first, I wanted to really identify what a toxic relationship was. Toxic behavior exists on a spectrum. So all people in all relationships will do some of these toxic things that we're getting ready to talk about some of the time, but that doesn't mean that these people are toxic people. We all have bad days, right? A toxic relationship is when the relationship becomes defined by those negative things and that negativity. And when that negativity becomes so constant and intense that it really starts to become part of our identity. We don't want that. We need to get that out of our souls. So on this spectrum of toxicity, on one hand, you've got like the terribly toxic people. Like the worst level of toxicity is going to be like a physical abuse relationship. On the other end of toxicity, like you've just got these people who drag you down. Like they're not bad people. They just drive us crazy. We don't want to spend a ton of time around them. They don't make us laugh. They don't make us happy. They don't make us the best version of ourselves. They're just not our favorite people to hang out with. They're just kind of undesirable. They're not toxic. Those are like the difficult people that God puts into our lives to teach us to be more patient with ourselves and others, right? But they're not toxic. So we're going to talk about the controlling, the manipulation, that really soul-crushing relationship stuff that just does not make us the best version of ourselves. So a lot of times at this point in the conversation, some people ask me, okay, well, like, if I'm sitting here talking with a friend and, maybe I see something in her, in a relationship. I'm like, oh, that really sounds kind of toxic. It's really easy to want to dive into that and say, well, how did the toxic relationship happen? But the thing is, this toxicity stuff can happen to the best of us. Nobody starts a relationship saying, oh, I think I need a toxic relationship today, right? A lot of times people change, circumstances happen, and relationships get to this point where we can't, and this is why marriage is hard, right? Where you can't rebound, like you can't find your way back. Maybe it's because one party is emotionally stunted or emotionally unhealthy. But just the bad relationships, the toxic relationship stuff just happens to the best of us, even with good intentions. So I would like to also say here as a reminder that toxic people, like people that we might, we're going to jump into a list of things that reveal toxicity. These people that are going to come to our minds, they're not bad people. They might be emotionally unhealthy, but they're not usually dangerous the way a narcissist. Now, narcissism is on the far end of toxicity, or even, and I say heaven forbid, like a sociopath would be. And I feel like I've met a couple in my life. But toxic people, they're people who have had a perpetual bad day, and for one reason or another, they cannot get to the other side of that. So a lot of times what we'll also do is we'll be like, oh, let me help fix them. No, we can't fix them. So asking, like, how did this happen? Like trying to define the cause of toxicity is not going to help us. Once we have recognized toxicity in our relationships, the only thing that matters is distance, not the cause and effect. It's what we need to do is we need to remove ourselves from that situation and get as much distance between ourselves and that person as possible. We are not therapists. We cannot fix the world. And if we try to fix them, we're just going to find ourselves sucked more and more into that toxic cycle. And we don't want to perpetuate that. I do not want to spread toxicity. I want to spread goodness and love and life and joy. So that's the cause and effect angle of things. Okay. So I have 17 points. I realize that this is a lot. I'm going to try to fly through them on how to identify toxic relationships. And right now I have the comments covered up with my notes. So I'll jump, you're welcome to jump in and share your thoughts if you have any. And I'm just going to keep kind of bouncing back and forth to make sure I'm not missing any of the conversation over there. So number one, I kind of already mentioned this. Toxic people just don't make us feel good about ourselves. They, when we leave them, we often feel like we are questioning our self-worth. And this may be intentional or unintentional on their part, but we just don't feel good about ourselves. Like that is a sign that we have been that we are either in a toxic relationship or we were just in a toxic we've been in a toxic relationship or we were just in a toxic situation. Two different things. Okay, number 2, toxic people tell me, like, give me some amens or high fives or something if any of this resonates with you. Toxic people very often use questions as traps. You feel like you're in a conversation with them and you feel like they are trying to catch you on something. They are trying to pick apart your answers. They're trying to find holes in your theories, or they're always trying to pick a fight. And there's definitely no grace for mistakes. Even if you fess up and say, hey, I'm sorry, I misspoke or something like that. Like they are just out to catch you. I've been in a relationship like that. So I'm gonna be like, I hear that one. Okay. Number 3, very often in a toxic relationship, you will find that you are not allowed to have a need. So in relationships, we have needs, like we have the need to feel connected, or we have the need to feel validated, or the need to feel appreciated. And in a toxic relationship, if you bring up this need with someone who's toxic, they're going to mock it or laugh at you or just do the opposite of validate you and basically say you don't have any right to have that need. And a lot of times expressing this type of need will end in a fight or accusations, and you find yourself on this downward toxic spiral again. Number 4, toxic relationships tend to be really one-sided. So you're putting in effort to improve things and they don't put in any effort to improve things. And again, this kind of goes back to like, we can't fix it. Once we recognize it, we need to put boundaries in place. And we're going to talk about how to do that in a little bit. Number 5, toxic people tend to keep score. They love to bring up old faults to shame and manipulate and control you. And they tend to revolve around, the conversations tend to revolve around your weaknesses instead of your strengths. A healthy relationship is going to recognize your strengths and reinforce those to you. Toxic and negative people are going to point out your weaknesses and continually point them out, which is going to make you feel terrible about yourself. But that's one way they're using control to manipulate the situation. Number 6 sign of toxic relationships is abuse, physical and verbal, period, the end. We know it's bad. Number 7 is passive aggression. And this is a little bit, sneakier, more covert. But at passive aggression, you all know what I'm talking about, but it's aggression that is subtle and disguised. It's an attack. But very often it's so subtle that if you said, hey, quit being passive aggressive, the person would say, like, I don't know what you're talking about. But we've all seen this in our lives. We all know what it means. We all may have even played that card every now and then. But it's a manipulation tactic. And once we recognize these things in others as well, we can fix them in ourselves. And so using passive aggression as a tactic is never good. Okay, number 8, in toxic relationships, there's usually no resolution. Every conflict ends in an argument. This perpetuates unmet needs, which leads to more resentment, which leads to more arguments. So you can see how you get caught in that vicious cycle with toxic people. Number 9, toxic people are involved. There's a lot of one-upsmanship. Now this is different. I've been in conversations before where I see people unintentionally doing the one-upsmanship thing. One friend tells a story and the other one says, oh yeah. So there's a difference between people trying to relate to each other from stories and people one-upping. And the difference is, and so maybe you've seen this or maybe you've done this in conversations and relationships you've had, but the difference between trying to relate to somebody on a story and one-upping them is, is the first person being validated and affirmed and heard before the second story is told. And in toxic relationships, the toxic person is always putting their needs before your needs, and so you'll see a lot of deprioritization of your stuff and a lot of prioritization of theirs. Number 10, in a toxic relationship, there is no privacy. We've all heard the crazy girlfriend boyfriend stories when somebody is stalking the text messages, the mail, the cell phone records, all that stuff. But a lack of privacy in a relationship, and I'm not talking about accountability. That's different. Like we all deserve to be able to ask our significant others or our friends, like, hey, what's going on with this, without accusation. We're not looking for anything. We're just asking how it's going. So transparency is something that you'll see in a healthy relationship that transparency can't exist in a toxic relationship, because you've got those people always out to catch you. You've got the toxic people always trying to catch you in something. So you feel like you can't do anything right. So the privacy, anyway, it's just bad. You can see how it all builds on itself. Number 11, lying. And I'm not talking about white lies or mistaken statements or things like that. I'm talking about blatant, consistent, all out lying. This can also take the form of gaslighting, which I didn't really understand what gaslighting meant until recently. I had a friend who was getting out of an extremely abusive relationship, and she would state the truth, and the opposite party would just say that's not the truth. And it went on for so long that she started going, am I crazy? And so that's what gaslighting is when people try to make you think you're crazy because they don't want to believe what you're saying. And so they just say that it's not true. And it's just it's literally like the craziest thing. But that's a form of lying. And that is a sign of a toxic relationship. Number 12, another sign would be micromanagement. This kind of goes with the privacy thing, but a toxic relationship is one where all the decisions are made for you. Your opinion doesn't matter. Your wants don't matter. Your needs don't matter. And decisions are made without your input. You're not listened to or heard because you're being controlled. Number 13, this one pops out to me as well. Toxic people take everything as a personal insult. I don't know why this is, because I have had a recent interaction with someone who's struggling with this, and I don't even think they know it. But it just boggles my mind that everything is taken so personally. Like every single question is taken as a personal insult, and it prevents growth on that person's part, the fact that it's taken as an insult, but it also drives people away, and people won't be around that person because of that. So don't take things as an insult if you don't want to start being toxic. Okay, number 14, there is no respect for boundaries. So this can happen in all types of relationships, romantic relationships or friendships. But if you set a boundary and it's completely disregarded, they are not respecting you, your value, or your worth, and that could be the sign of a toxic situation. Number 15, toxic people are takers. In one of my favorite reference books, Give and Take, the author Adam M. Grant talks about how there's this range of people, and he calls them givers, taker, actually he goes from bottom up, givers, takers, matchers, and fakers. So givers are at the very bottom of the totem pole. There is a group of givers at the top called strategic givers, but there's takers, matchers, and fakers in there too. And he's talking about how people use their networks and their resources to advance. Givers are on the very bottom, but takers, I mean, we've all experienced those type of people in our lives, and takers are a big sign of toxicity. If you find yourself in a relationship where you're giving and you're not getting anything back at all, now we're not keeping score here. We're not, that's what a toxic person would do. But if you're just not getting anything out of it, you might be in a toxic relationship. I will actually also pause and say, on a personal note, my husband and I recently realized that we had a toxic relationship like that. or we were just giving so much to a particular situation. And not only were we not getting anything back out of it, it wasn't even being acknowledged or recognized. And so we had to put distance there for ourselves. And it feels so good when we get to the boundary setting stuff. We'll talk a little bit about how good boundaries feel. At first they're scary, but then they start to feel really good. Okay. Number 16. Toxic people are usually always right. And they won't admit when they're wrong, and they won't take personal responsibility. And this is very dangerous because it leads to number 17, which is toxic people very often have a victim mentality. Now, I don't know how much you know about victim mentality. I feel like I have had different points in my life where I've had coaches or therapists or even bosses look at me and say, like, you're being a victim about this right now. And I don't want to accept that. But what I have to do, what the thing about victim mode is, the way you get out of victim mode is by taking personal responsibility and ownership, not of the other person, but of what you can control. So anytime I've gotten that piece of feedback that, like, oh, I'm playing the victim or something like that, I have to take a step back and say, okay, what part of this situation can I control? What can I take ownership of? We are where we are as a result of the choices that we have made. And so even taking responsibility for the choices that got us to that point is going to move us from victimhood to a more empowered mode. And we talked a lot about empowering our minds yesterday, and making sure that we don't stay in that victim mentality is an important part of empowering our minds. So those are 17. Those are not all the signs of a toxic person or a toxic relationship, but those are 17 signs. And in that list, you might have thought of certain people that exhibit some of those behaviors, and they're toxic, and maybe you're not in relationship with them. You just now we know, like, okay, we're going to stay a little bit further away from those people. And you also might have recognized some signs of a toxic relationship that you're in. And again, that can often happen without us realizing. Like, we're in this relationship, and all of a sudden we're like, this doesn't feel right. This doesn't seem good. And then you can go back to that list and you're like, oh, it's not good. And this is similar to the situation my husband and I were recently in. I was like, I think this is toxic. Sure enough, I looked at my list. I'm like, yeah, this isn't healthy at all. We need to put some distance here. So that's the thing, that once you realize, that's the only appropriate response to recognizing toxicity is distance. So if you think you're in a toxic relationship that is affecting you, the question that you need to ask is, what now? Well, it's time to put up some walls, create some of that space, some of that distance. You need to be clear in your own mind about where that relationship stops and you start, because it's two different things. And you as an individual you can stand alone, and you should stand alone. You don't need that toxicity in your life to function. That would be called codependency. That's a whole nother thing we're not going to talk about today. But you can distance yourself in two ways, physically and emotionally. A toxicity relation, hang on, let me look at my notes here. What we want to do here is we want to learn about ourselves. We want to recognize patterns and triggers so that we can be mindful about what's happening, so that we can learn about ourselves and prevent finding ourselves in these situations again. And just need to remember that we're independently, we are awesome and amazing, and we don't need all this dysfunction. So it's important to remember at this point that all the fight and all the fixing in the world isn't going to change the toxic relationship, because one or both parties have probably already emotionally moved on. It doesn't matter. Hang on, let me look at notes. Fighting to hold on to something that is fighting you is only going to ruin you. So moving on is essential. What we need to do is figure out how to let go with grace and love and put some distance in. But before, and so I've got a few things. I think there's like 11 ideas about how to move on. But before I get into this, a quick warning. Cutting off toxic people can be a little bit nuclear. That's part of what toxicity is. It's toxic because there was fear and negativity there in the first place, and they're going to sense that distance, and there's a potential for sort of an eruption at that point. But still, even with that being said, it is absolutely crucial to remove these people or remove yourself from these situations. Either way, it could be a situation, could be a person, but it's essential to remove in a healthy and rational way. So first of all, first tip on this is it's totally fine if this is a process. So it's not always easy to communicate with toxic people. They don't respect your boundaries now, so it's not likely that they're going to respect them later or after a conversation. And you may have to do this gradually and over time. It will, once you start the process, I promise it will happen more quickly than you think it's going to take. And very often, sometimes what happens is a toxic person will sense that you are creating distance and they'll want to play the trump card. And so they'll just go put all the distance there. And they're doing it to hurt you. But because you've already made the decision to put the distance there, you can say, thank you. You just did all the hard work for me. That's happened to me a couple of times. But keep in mind that it can be a gradual process. Point number 2, remember that if you are anticipating having a conversation about wanting a little bit more space in this relationship, you don't owe them a huge explanation. What's happening in your life and in your heart is your business. And as long as you are approaching them with grace and love and not trying to intentionally hurt them or manipulate them or control them, these techniques you will only find yourself deeper in a toxic relationship if you try to use these techniques to manipulate or control the situation. But you are your own person and you owe them no explanation. One of my favorite phrases of all time is no is a complete sentence. One word, no. And you don't need to be rude about it. Your feelings are not open for debate. And so if they try to debate those feelings, maybe you just need to keep those to yourself. But you don't need to feel, I want to give you permission right now. You do not need to come prepared with a total explanation. You don't have to do that. Okay. Third tip on starting to put that distance and that space in a toxic relationship is if you decide to talk to them in person, you might want to do it in a public place. Now, I have seen a few toxic people, and sometimes a public place does not deter them from creating a scene or wanting to create a scene. But it's less likely that it's going to explode or potentially turn dangerous if you're on the far end of that toxicity spectrum and you're moving towards narcissism or abuse or something like that. Doing that in a public place might be a little bit healthier than doing it one-on-one. Fourth point I would like to make is one thing that you might want to consider, I'm not going to say you need to do this because I realize that all relationships are different and navigating them can be different for everybody, but block on social media. I don't do a lot of blocking on social media, and I actually consider myself really blessed and lucky not to have to do that because I know there are trolls out there. But, and I also know that blocking friends can be a little nuclear, but at the same time, a lot of times when I've been in a toxic situation, I just get to the point where I'm done. I have a friend at my old company who, like, there was some drama. It was all women working together. There was some drama one day. And I walked into her office and she was like, people around here need to check their drama at the door. I was like, can I have a t-shirt that says that? Like, can that be over the sign of every doorway in my home? Check your drama at the door. So I don't do drama, and I don't like it when people do. And if they do, if they do drama, it makes it a lot easier for me to just say, I'm blocking this. Like, I do not want this in my life. And at first, especially for those of us who are people pleasers, doing something like blocking feels like we're going to be hurting somebody's feelings. And it just feels like something that might be too awkward. But the crazy thing about respect is that when you draw that line, most of the time, people actually think more highly of you. Like and if they might not like it, they might, but what it does in the other relationships with people in your life is it makes them go, oh, she drew a line. She has a boundary. Oh, I'm not going to mess with her. And it's just a really respectful way to say, I don't do drama. So consider blocking people on social media. You can also delete phone numbers. I've done that pretty recently as well. I just don't do drama, you guys. I just don't do it at all. Okay. The next tip, number 5, is remember not to argue. If you're having a conversation with somebody, they're going to want to, a lot of times what toxic people do is they're going to pull out that laundry list, that blame list, and they're going to be like, that scorecard they were keeping. Well, you did this and this and this and this and this. My husband and I had to fight a really small legal situation one time, and we ended up just figuring out what our case was, like what was our main point. And all we did was restate that case over and over and over again. There were lots of other little blame points that I would have liked to have made because those would have emotionally validated me, but that wasn't going to get to the outcome. That was just going to confuse the situation and hurt the other person. I didn't want to hurt the other person. I just wanted away from the other person. And to get away from the other person, there was only one point I needed to make, and I needed to make it so consistently that was all that it wasn't a judge, but it was like I don't know, the mediator. That was the only thing I wanted them to know, because that was the only thing that was going to put space between me and that other person. And so it's really easy to fall into this idea of like, well, I want to argue this because, and especially those of us who have a little justice streak in us, we like really want to argue all the points. Like, well, she did this and this and this, or he did this and this and this. Doesn't matter. Like, what matters is like the one key point that puts the boundary in place. So spend some time thinking about what that is, and then be prepared to restate that boundary over and over and over again. Do not fall into the trap of arguing with anybody about it, the other party about it. Okay, number 6 point is consider writing a letter. This can go 2 ways. You can write a letter to them and send it to them, but also very often if you write a letter and you get all that stuff out on paper, you're going to it's going to be sort of a cathartic journaling exercise, and you may not even need to send the letter. Like writing all that stuff out and processing it in your mind. And I am a big believer in handwriting stuff. It's different. Like, typing is great, but handwriting helps you process things differently. A lot of times you don't need to send it. Another thing, if you do want to write a letter, another thing to remember is this is a personal preference. I am not big on emails. They can be forwarded. You can copy and paste. You can screenshot. It's just way too easy to perpetuate that stuff. And yes, if you write a paper letter, like it can still be duplicated, but it's going to be a lot more difficult for them to duplicate that and perpetuate that. And then plus maybe it'll get lost. But I am just a big fan of not putting in writing anything that I don't want repeated or seen or passed around. So that's just a general rule of thumb about life in general, I think. So if you write the letter, maybe just consider hanging on to it for a couple days, sleeping on it before sending it on. My number 7 point or suggestion about putting some distance between you and a toxic person would be gradual distance. So what this looks like is, instead of like, maybe the toxic person, and codependent relationships tend to be like this, but you're texting all day, every day, back and forth. Maybe you just need to put a little space between, like, instead of responding to a text message 30 seconds later, maybe it's 30 minutes, maybe it's 3 hours, maybe it's this afternoon, maybe it's tomorrow. And once you start doing that with small forms of communication, it's easier to put more distance in there. You're doing it with text messages, and then you're doing it with phone calls, and you're doing it with emails, and then you're doing it with the amount of time you see that other person, live and in person. But just adding a little bit of time gradually and this is one way if you're a little bit nervous about just having like one big confrontation, just don't. Just put tiny little increments of space in your communication until you can stretch that out further and further. And at some point in time, this is where a toxic person is going to be like, why are you avoiding me? You can be like, I'm not avoiding you. Like, I'm responding just like I should. And, another thing that my husband and I say a lot of time around this house is it's our job to keep our own nose clean. And so that's often a checkpoint for us. Like, we don't want to do anything that's going to be passive aggressive or manipulative to anybody else. But how can we do the right thing? What is the right thing to do is constantly a question that we ask. Okay, my next tip on just creating this boundary in this space with toxic people in your life is don't be sentimental. Every relationship, despite its toxicity, has good stuff. It has happy memories, laughter, all kinds of just things that you're going to want to hang on to. But again, once you've identified that toxicity, there's nothing that you can do to restore the relationship. So don't romanticize that stuff. Be grateful for those moments and those memories and then move on. But don't feel like don't allow those sentiments to keep you hanging on. The next thing I want to say is you may have to be honest with yourself about your own actions. And I do this as a general practice anyway. But anytime someone else's behavior is ticking me off or upsetting me for whatever reason, I take the opportunity to turn inward and ask myself if my actions are playing a part in that. Or I ask myself, what can I control about my actions and my response to that person? It comes back to like, I don't want any blood on my hands. Like, am I doing the right thing? So I will ask my husband, I will ask my friends, like, be honest with me about my behavior in this situation. Is there anything that I need to, it's kind of like the verse about take the log out of your own eye. And I think it's really important to ask that question. Like, is there anything I can fix about myself before I go off on a tirade about what's wrong with that person? Because that's just going to be a waste of my time. Learning about myself is going to be really valuable for me. My next point is if you've put some distance there, you might be very intentional and conscious about making some new friends, like putting some conscious effort towards and energy towards making new friends. We're going to talk a little bit more about how to build healthy relationships here in a minute. And I realize I'm flying through all of this. Oh, I forgot to look at the comments. Look at the comments. Oh, Paper Want Studios there. Yay, you made it. Just checking comments to make sure I haven't missed anything. But I had a situation a few years ago where I felt like I lost an entire group of friends because of toxicity, and I was just really sad. And so I poured myself into new friendships. Now, the new friendships didn't replace the old ones. They were different. The dynamics of that group of friends were different than the old group of friends, but it gave me something to be grateful for and to look forward to. And I loved looking at the good side. I loved exploring this new dynamic and finding out these really good things about this really cool group of people, and really valued what they brought to the table and how they approached their friendship with me as well. So the situation that my husband and I recently feel like we have gotten out of that was a little bit toxic has left us being very intentional about building some relationships, and we've scheduled dinners, a lot of dinners with a lot of people. We have the calendar is full every Friday night, and that gives us something to focus on as opposed to the hurt from which we came. Okay, last but not least, my 11th tip for creating that distance is don't forget to take care of yourself. We talked about this on Monday when we were talking about H, the help yourself: sleep, water, food, nutrition. Sleep, water, nutrition, movement. Do you need to take a walk around the block, get a good night's sleep, eat a salad, drink some water? All those are really simple things that you can do to take care of yourself. Now, I'm not talking about self-indulgence. Like if you were in a romantic relationship and you were like, I need to practice self-care. I'm going to go get my nails done, and you swipe that on a credit card. That could erupt in some arguments. However, remember that when you take care of yourself, that is not anything that anyone is allowed to make you feel guilty about. So practice self-care with moderation and restraint. Don't go so far that it's self-indulgence and bad management of your resources and your time. But take care of yourself, and if you've done it the right way, that person they are not allowed to make you feel guilty. That is a big red flag. So now I know I'm going to shift here to talk a little bit more about boundaries and dealing with toxic relatives, which is so hard because we more often than not love our relatives. We love the people in our lives. We also know every single button to push to tick them off and all their flaws. And sometimes even some of those relationships with people we love so much get to this point where they're toxic and we need to put a little bit of space there. And so this is where thinking about like emotional distance and physical distance can really help us. We may not be able to distance ourselves from some people physically. We may have to, this would happen with coworkers either. People you have to work with and you don't have any choice. Or it could happen in like a family type situation because of holiday events or because, you're caring for a parent or something like that. So it may be impossible to distance yourself physically, but you can control the situation and you can control your own emotions and you control the way you approach that. And I would recommend approaching it practically rather than emotionally. So you're going to have to stay kind of surface. You can't go deep. And if the other person tries to go deep, you just kind of have to smile and nod. What I do, and this sounds crazy, is I just kind of let, if I'm in a situation like this, I just let that person be front and center. And I do a lot of smile and nod. So you're still going to have to engage with that person, but you can keep it doesn't have to be familial. You don't have to relate to them in a familiar way. You can relate to them like they're a neighbor you saw on the street and greeted and are having a nice practical conversation with, So a lot of times being able to distance ourselves emotionally has to do with how we approach the situation and that engagement and interaction. Okay, so we've talked about family. Hang on one second. Okay, let's talk about boundaries really quickly. How to identify a boundary. Well, what is a boundary? The word boundary can be misleading because we're talking about creating distance. And so a lot of times we think, well, a boundary is going to completely separate this. But a healthy boundary is actually going to act as a connecting point for you in your relationships. It's going to cause other people to respect you. Like I said earlier, you draw that line in the sand and people actually respect boundaries. And so they think of you in higher esteem because you have said no to something. And I know that saying no is so hard for all of us. Every single human I've ever met has said that they have trouble saying no at some point in time or another. But a boundary is going to help us say no. And as people in our lives start to see that boundary in place, they'll be less likely to ask. Saying no gets easier. And all of a sudden you're on this upward spiral. So our boundaries can be shaped by our families, by our culture, by the location, the region that we're from, our personalities. They can be shaped by our life experiences. We all come from someplace different and we all interpret interactions with other humans a little bit differently. And our boundaries can change and evolve over the years. So let's talk really quickly about how to identify a boundary. The first question, I've got a few questions you can ask yourself here, are what are your rights? And I'm going to give you some permission here. You have a right to say no without feeling guilty. You have a right to be treated with respect for stating your needs. You have a right to state your needs. Your needs are just as important as someone else's. And you have a right to be accepting of your mistakes and failures, and you have a right to give yourself grace for those things. And then you have a right to not meet anybody else's expectations. Like their expectations are not a prerequisite for us to function or perform or sleep at night, you know? The next question that you can ask yourself in trying to identify boundaries is, what are your obligations? So just as you have rights and boundaries, so do other people. And while we can't control other people, we can control ourselves. And so we need to be aware of any time that we might be intentionally trying to make other people feel guilty, or intentionally or accidentally treating other people with disrespect. We have an obligation to treat others with respect. We have an obligation to not belittle others for their mistakes and failures. And we have an obligation to only hold them to reasonable expectations. And we can hold other people to expectations. That's a standard. We do that in our families. We do that in our friendships. We do that in our society. But unreasonable expectations are, we do not have a right to hold other people to unreasonable expectations. A third question that you can ask yourself about boundaries and like what's a good boundary for you is, what is your gut telling you? So your instincts can help you determine when someone is violating your boundaries and you need to set one up. And a big red flag on this is if you start thinking that is none of their business, you might need to check your boundaries. If you find yourself thinking that, you might need to figure out what kind of boundary you can draw, what kind of line in the sand you can draw right there. Another question you can ask yourself in trying to identify your boundaries or set some boundaries would be, what are your values? Identify your top 10, your top 5, your top 3 values, and then just reflect on those and ask yourself, how often do you feel like those values are challenged, or people push against those, or they get so close to like a value as a boundary. Like if you are not going to tolerate certain things, or certain things that we do not tolerate as a society, and that's a boundary. Those standards become boundaries in our lives. And then the last question that you can ask yourself in trying to identify what some of your boundaries are, have you ever felt out of place or exhausted because of someone else? So I've had situations where I walk out of a meeting and I just feel so flustered. Like and what happened was, in that meeting, someone else was getting flustered and I was allowing myself to take that on. And all I needed to do was set a mental boundary that said, I don't have to take on that negative energy. And I need a boundary here. And a lot of times you can set up an emotional boundary really quickly and just say, I'm going to choose not to respond to that in like kind, you know? So I've got a couple ways, 4 ways to set boundaries. Where are the top of my notes? 4 quick tips. Number 1, be assertive. Like you are the only person in charge of your life. Like you have the right to state your needs, and you have the right to state those with, like I said before, without being made to, feel guilty. And if you don't ever state those needs, people will never know that boundary is there. Number 2, learn to say no. And I know that that's so hard. The first time you say no to someone that needs a boundary, it's going to be hard. They're not going to like it. There might be tears, but it'll get easier. Again, people respect boundaries. Like as humans, I don't know how or why, but we're wired to respect other people's boundaries. So once we've made that case, things will be easier in the long run. Another thing, just my favorite tip on saying no is, I will often blame myself for being overcommitted. If I have to say no and I'm feeling really bad about it, I'll just say, I am so overcommitted right now. There's no possible way. If I did that, I would be for sure dropping a ball. And that way I'm not really saying no. I'm just saying, like, I wouldn't be able to do it anyway. That's my favorite way to say no. Number 3, don't be afraid to safeguard your spaces. If you feel like, just how we wouldn't let our kids go dig around in cleaning products under the sink, we need to just not leave our personal stuff lying around our desks at work, or, things like that. So don't be afraid to set technology boundaries, like deleting apps or not. Guys, don't email me ever. I rarely respond. And that's just a boundary I set. Like emails have become more and more impersonal, and I would rather write friends letters. And I've just kind of set this technology email boundary as I'm not there. I'm not in my inbox, and so you're not going to be able to reach me. So that's a boundary for me. But think about from a technology standpoint, what kind of boundaries you need to set and create. It might be like setting a timer and only checking your email at a certain time, or eliminating interruptions by turning off Do Not Disturb or turning off notifications on your phone, things like that. And then the fourth thing that you can do in setting a boundary is get assistance or support. So you could talk to a therapist and say, I really need to set this boundary with this person or in this situation. Check in with me next week. Or you could go tell a coworker, or you could call a friend and say, I need to respond differently the next time this person asks something of me. And sometimes just talking through that with somebody else kind of helps us recalibrate our boundaries. And it's just really important for us to like learn from all these experiences as we go through life. Because we get better at it, we'll never know it all, but we get better at it. So it's also important for us with other people's boundaries to watch for cues, to be really not overly sensitive, but just sensitive in general about, trying not to make them feel too uncomfortable. Men don't do this, just FYI. I feel like women could do it a little bit less, or with different. We're so worried about hurting other people's feelings, and like guys aren't really worried about it at all. So I feel like there's a balance in there. Like we need to be a little bit less sensitive, and maybe sometimes men need to be a little bit more sensitive. Another thing that you can do for others to help recognize their boundaries and respect them is just ask them, like, what, is this a boundary for you? And not to push your own boundaries on them, but just to find out where they stand and ask them what they need. Okay, so we've talked about toxicity, not fun, really serious stuff. We've talked about boundaries, and now I want to move to a little happier bucket of things here at the end of this about how to cultivate meaningful relationships. Now I have a little caveat to this, and I called it my rule of 10, and I'll explain why, but you need to figure out what your rule is. And I realized this whenever my kids were young and I had a crazy business and so busy. My hair was constantly on fire, and I think I had between 8 and 12 employees reporting directly to me every single day. And I realized that I only had room for about, I think I said at the time, 10 meaningful conversations. It's much less now. But we had a nanny that took care of my kids. She mattered because she was taking care of my kids. I had to stop and have a meaningful conversation with her every morning. That meant saying, how are you? And really meaning it. I had to have a meaningful conversation with my operations manager. I had to have a meaningful conversation with my husband. I had 3 kids. So ideally I was having or actually 2 at the time, but 1 on the way. I needed to have meaningful conversations with them, even though they were really small. I needed to spend some really good one-on-one time. And I realized that I had more employees and more relationships than I had time for meaningful conversations. And so they say that we are like the 5 people that we spend the most time with. And so I would ask yourself in the situation, who are you surrounding yourself with? Like, who is getting your 5 most meaningful conversations per day? Because we do not have enough time to spend with everybody. We can't go around. And when I say meaningful conversations, I mean one-on-one stuff. I'm not talking about me talking to you guys on the internet. Like, this is meaningful, but this is not a connection point. I can't see you. And so while we're connecting, we're not connecting in like the kind of way that a soul needs to feel connected and valued and loved and recognized. And And so this doesn't count. So I've got room for about 5 meaningful conversations per day. And I have 3 kids and 1 husband and a best friend. And so it gets eaten up pretty quickly. So think about your rule of 5, or what your rule number is. Like, can you have 10 meaningful conversations a day? Awesome. Who are your people? If you can only have 3 conversations per day, great. Think about who your people are. And then you could schedule that stuff in your planner. Just write it down. It's super important for us to build these relationships. Other things that we can do to build meaningful relationships, we can recognize, number 1, we can recognize the things that we're alike and the things that we're different and that make us different. So appreciate the similarities and appreciate each other's differences, and then just acknowledge that. We can, number 2, we can pay compliments to people. When I like, one of the things that is constantly going through my head is, when you see something good, say it. So if you see somebody doing something really good, like, call it out. There's always going to be criticism and critique, but say thank you. Tell somebody they're good at something. Compliment their hair, their clothes, whatever. But say something good about someone. If you see something good in someone, speak it. The third thing that you can do to build meaningful relationships is get offline. So this is going to mean that you're either going to have to travel to see people, which I do a lot. I schedule trips around when a lot of my friends are going to be in Nashville and things like that, so that I can get that meaningful relationship time in with them. I think I'm on number 4, which is have people over for dinner. Show them hospitality. And this can be a little bit awkward at first. My husband and I lived in a lake community for 4 years, and we had people over for dinner all the time. It was not a big deal. And now that we've moved back to the city, we've noticed that, our lake friends will come over still, and they're used to it. But our city friends are like, oh, I'm allowed to just, like, walk in your door? I'm like, yes, like, this is how we do life. And so it's been a real privilege and an honor to schedule all these dinners that we're going to do this fall. And I'm really excited about showing people all this hospitality. I'm very, very excited about using hospitality to build meaningful relationships in our family's life. Number 5, writing notes, like writing actual letters, sending text messages of appreciation, writing thank you notes, but staying in touch. I was reading a book yesterday and thinking about how we used to write letters, and then we wrote emails, and now all we do is send text messages. Like, when was the last time you sat down and wrote a letter to someone? So I don't know if you guys have been following along on my Instagram, or not my Instagram, but I've talked about it on Instagram. But my friend Lindsay Sherbandi, her little girl, is in a coma right now. She's 7.5 years old. And I woke up this morning thinking about, her name's Ava. And if you're watching this, you probably have seen the story or know what I'm talking about. But sweet little Ava needs prayer. And I woke up this morning thinking about her. And in my head, I just started composing this letter to Lindsay. And I know that Lindsay's phone is blowing up. I know her text messages are blowing up. I know her DMs are blowing up. I know her business, which she's got an amazing team running it. Like, I hope it's blowing up for her. And she doesn't have time to read a letter. But I pulled out my computer and documented my thoughts and texted that over to her. Like, dear Lindsay, love, Whitney. It was long text. But like the long form letter stuff, like more than just, hey, how you doing? How's your day going? I don't even feel like I say that to very many people anymore. Like, I'll say that to my top 5 people, but I'll ask my kids, my best friend, David, like, I'll ask them how their day was, and I genuinely want to know, but like, when was the last time you actually stopped and wrote somebody a letter? Let's just think about that. Number 6, what we can do to cultivate meaningful relationships in our life is learn to listen. Like, a lot of times we want to give advice. I actually had a situation a couple weeks ago where a friend, I was just talking, like, something was bothering me, and I was just kind of rambling. And she started in trying to give advice, and I was like, I can't handle this. So Maybe that wasn't the appropriate response. Maybe I should have figured out a different way to say it. She didn't like my response at all. The response was me setting a boundary, but she didn't want to hear that I did not want her advice. And I said, wait a second, like, if we're friends, like, I need to express what I need, and I just need somebody to listen right now. I don't need advice. I don't need band-aids. And I don't think she liked it. And she did kind of go on her own, which is fine, totally fine. I really think that setting that type of boundary in a friendship, in a relationship, will come back to us. She's not my friend anymore. She might be angry at me right now. I have no idea. That's not my business. I stated what my needs were. I dealt with the situation respectfully. I asked for what I needed. And after it was all over and I had ticked her off, I analyzed my actions and my needs and made sure that I didn't have any blood on my hands to bring all of this stuff full circle. So it's important to listen and not always relate back to other people or try to solve things. I mean, you can relate, but let's not try to solve everything for people. Let's not try to fix it. We can't fix it. Sometimes we just need to listen, you know? Number 7, just be grateful for the people in your life. This kind of goes back to paying compliments. Just tell them you're thankful for them and that you love them. Tell them what they're good at. Spread that positivity. And then number 8, this is what we're doing with the hospitality thing, is get them on your schedule. When are you going to talk to them next? When are you going to see them next? When are you going to spend time together? When are you going to meet for coffee? When are you going to go for dinner? And what we did this year was on the back of the calendar that hangs in our pantry, I made a list of all the people that our family is trying to build intentional relationships with. And we've got those people on the calendar. And if somebody cancels, I just go down to the next on the list and find somebody else and invite them, and we'll hang out with them again. So anyway, in conclusion, there are toxic relationships. There are boundaries that we can set. All of this is good for us from an emotional standpoint. And if we practice healthy relationships, we will feel connected, which will in turn make us more emotionally healthy, which will in turn make us more physically healthy. And all this stuff all this stuff in heart, all of these steps are going to build on each other to make us the best version of ourselves we can possibly be. And when we are the best version of ourselves that we can possibly be, we're going to empower others around us to also be the best versions of themselves, which nothing fires me up more than that. Okay, tomorrow we are going to talk about R. This is your resources and responsibilities. This is the stuff category. We're going to talk a little bit about routines and rhythms. We've been talking about how all of this stuff adds up to a balanced life. But tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit about scheduling stuff. We're going to talk about finances a lot. We're going to talk about checklist kind of stuff. So it's going to be, we're talking about meal planning tomorrow, actually, as well. And maybe some house stuff, not cleaning. I have some resources I'm going to give you on that, but not an expert house cleaner here. So anyway, join me tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. on the same page that you're watching this right now. This recording will be available at the end of this for 24 hours. And watch it. And then if you're interested in purchasing the whole set afterwards, they will be available for you to purchase. Thanks, you guys. Shoot me any feedback over on Instagram, direct message, or you can always email hello@whitneyenglish.com. If you email me, I might get it, but I'm likely not to respond. So thanks for joining me. See you tomorrow.